Iran just discovered the weakness in America's war machine. That sounds like a movie trailer line. And if you're seeing it everywhere right now, it's because it's the perfect headline. It's simple, it's dramatic, it has a clear winner and a clear loser. But real conflict doesn't work like a trailer. So here's what you're going to get in this video, up front, so you know exactly what you're staying for. I'm going to give you a clean framework for what weakness actually means in modern war, the three pressure points Iran has been exploiting the most, and the one mistake people make when they talk about this that turns them into free marketing for propaganda. And I'll give you the mini payoff right now. The weakness isn't that America can't fight. The weakness is that modern war punishes scale, punishes endurance, and punishes expensive defense against cheap attack. That's the center of it. Now let's walk through it carefully, because this is where the internet gets sloppy. When people say America's war machine, they usually imagine a single thing: unstoppable hardware, jets, carriers, missiles, special forces, the cool stuff. But the war machine is not just hardware, it's a system. It's supply lines, basing, munitions stockpiles, maintenance cycles, industrial replacement speed, coordination across allies, and the ability to operate for weeks and months without burning through your own capacity. So when someone says Iran found the weakness, you should immediately ask, do they mean tactical weakness, like a specific weapon vulnerability, or do they mean systemic weakness, like cost and capacity? Because those are completely different conversations, and most viral clips mash them into one sentence so you'll feel like the conclusion is obvious. It's not. Now, let's anchor this in what's actually been reported recently, because we are not doing vibes. There's been extensive reporting in early March 2026 about the intensity of the regional fight, including large missile and drone salvos, U.S. and allied defensive activity, and attacks on U.S. facilities in the region, The Washington Post. There's also reporting that Iranian launches have dropped sharply from the opening phase of the conflict, suggesting depletion, disruption, or rationing, depending on which analysis you trust. The Wall Street Journal. At the same time, U.S. officials have claimed significant degradation of Iran's higher-end air defenses, which changes the air picture over Iran but doesn't magically remove the broader regional risk environment. Business Insider. So if anyone is telling you a clean story, either Iran is winning or Iran is finished, that should trigger your skepticism, because the real story is more nuanced and, honestly, more interesting. Now let's define the phrase that everyone keeps throwing around. What would it mean for Iran to discover the weakness in America's war machine? It would mean Iran has identified a repeatable way to impose cost, friction, and risk on the U.S. system faster than the U.S. can comfortably absorb it. Not a way to defeat the U.S. overnight, a way to bleed time, attention, resources, and political tolerance. That's what modern asymmetric pressure looks like, and Iran's playbook for that has three major pressure points. Here they are. Pressure point 1, saturation. Pressure point 2, cost exchange. Pressure point 3, the geography of U.S. presence. And if you understand these three, you will understand why the phrase weakness keeps showing up, because these aren't secret, they're structural. Let's start with saturation, because this is the simplest and the most misunderstood. Saturation is when the sky becomes crowded. Drones, missiles, decoys, multiple directions, multiple altitudes, multiple speeds, enough to stress sensors, operators, and defensive magazines. And here's the hard truth. Even if you can intercept most threats, saturation still works. Because defense is not just about interception rates. Defense is about endurance. How long can you keep intercepting at that tempo without running out of interceptors, without exhausting crews, without shifting assets away from other theaters? We've seen this logic in public reporting for years, especially in the Red Sea era. Reports describe the U.S. Navy firing large numbers of missiles to defend shipping and itself against drone and missile attacks, highlighting the sheer volume of defensive expenditure required. Stars and stripes. Now zoom forward into the current conflict environment. where there has been reporting of hundreds of missiles and large numbers of drones being launched in the opening days, even if the pace later declined. The Wall Street Journal. That is saturation warfare. Not because every projectile hits, because every projectile forces a decision, and decisions under time pressure are where mistakes and costs accumulate. Now, pressure point 2 is the one that defense analysts keep circling because it's brutally simple. Cost exchange, cheap attack, expensive defense. It's the reason drones change the math of conflict. If a defender fires high-end interceptors at low-cost threats repeatedly, they may win every tactical engagement and still lose strategically by draining their own inventory and budgets. Even defense-focused analysis pieces have been blunt about this, describing a cost exchange problem in Red Sea air defense, where expensive interceptors were used against cheaper threats, raising concerns about magazine depletion and replenishment pace. Defense.info. Now, I want you to really feel the implication. If Iran can force the US and its partners into repeated defensive spending, even without landing many hits, Iran is still imposing attacks. Attacks paid in missiles, readiness, maintenance, and attention. And that's where the war machine language becomes real. Because war machines aren't just judged by how hard they hit. They're judged by whether they can keep operating at tempo without breaking the supply chain behind them, which brings us to pressure point 3, geography. The US doesn't fight from its own backyard in the Middle East. It fights from bases and facilities spread across the region, fixed points that can be threatened, politically constrained, and stressed. There's been reporting about drone attacks hitting U.S. diplomatic or support facilities in Iraq amid broader regional violence, with intercepts and at least one impact described. The Washington Post. There's also public reporting emphasizing how Iranian missile and drone attacks on Gulf nations risk pulling more countries in, and how U.S. presence in the Gulf is central to the operating environment. PBS. That's the geography issue. When your posture relies on forward presence, your opponent doesn't need to sink a carrier to create problems. They can threaten runways, logistics hubs, fuel depots, and diplomatic facilities. They can create political pressure inside host countries. They can force dispersal. They can force protective measures. They can force evacuation of non-essential staff. All of that is friction. And friction is the enemy of smooth power projection. Now here's where people get this wrong. They think the weakness is some secret backdoor, like a single vulnerability in a jet or a radar. Sometimes that happens. Sure. But the bigger weakness in modern conflict is often not a hack. It's math. It's the math of scale. It's the math of inventory. It's the math of endurance. Now let's talk about something that doesn't get enough attention, but is quietly one of the most effective ways to stress a modern force. Electronic interference. You don't have to destroy a system to degrade it. If you can jam, spoof, or confuse navigation and tracking in a wide area, you can create uncertainty. And uncertainty forces slower operations, wider safety margins, and higher stress. There have been recent reports about GNSS interference and GPS jamming affecting shipping and navigation in the Strait of Hormuz and surrounding waters, with assessments linking the risk environment to Iranian activity and the broader conflict period. Inside GNSS. This matters because War Machine is not just weapons, it's movement, it's logistics, it's coordination. When navigation and tracking become less reliable, everything becomes harder, especially in crowded environments. Now, I want to give you a concrete, non-technical example so this doesn't feel like a lecture. Imagine you're defending a region and you're trying to maintain readiness. If threats are sporadic, you can handle it. But if you have repeated waves, even small ones, you have to keep assets on alert, keep crews rotating, keep interceptors available, keep decision makers engaged. That constant readiness posture is exhausting. It's like being forced to sprint, then walk, then sprint again, forever, with no predictable schedule. Even if you never get knocked out, the fatigue builds. And fatigue is one of the biggest hidden vulnerabilities in any system. Now, if you're thinking, Okay, but hasn't Iran taken heavy damage too? Yes, and that's an important part of the story. There's reporting that US and Israeli operations have significantly degraded Iranian air defenses and struck a large number of targets, and that Iranian launch rates dropped sharply after the initial phase. Business Insider. So Iran isn't operating from a position of infinite freedom, but here's the point. Iran doesn't need to win the air domain over Iran to stress the US war machine regionally. Iran can lean on distributed pressure, drones, missiles, proxy actions, information operations, maritime disruption, electronic interference, and those can be used to impose costs even while under air pressure. Now, here's the part people will misunderstand if they only look at the opening salvos. They'll see a decline in launches and conclude, the threat is over. But a decline in launch rate can mean multiple things. It can mean depletion. It can mean disruption of launchers and infrastructure. It can mean rationing for strategic effect. And in any of those cases, the broader lesson still stands. The opening surge demonstrates capacity for saturation, and the response demonstrates how expensive it is to defend at that tempo. That's the weakness people are circling. Now, I promised you the mistake that people make that turns them into free distribution for propaganda. So here it is, and I'm going to say it clean. They treat capability like it equals outcome. Capability is what you can do. Outcome is what you can sustain. And sustain is where modern war gets ugly. Because war is not a highlight reel. It's a supply contest. It's an endurance contest. It's an attention contest. Now, there's another piece of this that matters, and it's the part that makes the story viral every time someone says it. People love the idea that a smaller power found the weakness of a bigger power. It's a satisfying narrative, but if you actually want to understand it, you need to frame it correctly. This is not new. This is the logic of asymmetric warfare updated for the drone age. The goal is not to outgun the US. The goal is to force the US to spend more than it wants, for longer than it wants, in more places than it wants, under tighter political constraints than it wants. And you don't do that by winning one battle. You do that by stressing the system. Now, let's bring this back to the phrase war machine in a way that matters to you. If Iran has found the weakness, you would expect to see three things continue to show up, even if headlines change. 1. Repeated low-cost threats that force high-cost defenses. 2. Attacks or harassment that exploit the geography of forward U.S. presence. 3. Interference and uncertainty that degrade clarity without needing direct destruction. And there are public reports and analysis in recent days pointing to all three as relevant issues in this conflict environment. Drones and missiles as a major Iranian investment, ongoing attacks affecting U.S. regional facilities, and navigation interference in the Gulf region. Bloomberg.com. Now, does that mean the U.S. can't respond? No. The U.S. has massive capabilities, and there's reporting of thousands of strikes and deep operations. Business Insider. But capability doesn't erase constraints. Even U.S.-focused defense analysis has raised concerns that recent operations highlight capacity vulnerabilities, especially when you zoom out and ask what happens if the U.S. has to sustain high tempo in multiple theaters. National Defense Magazine. That's the bigger strategic anxiety. Not can the U.S. win a fight, but can the U.S. sustain multiple fights without running into inventory, industrial, and readiness bottlenecks? Now let me give you the three realistic paths forward for this story, because people love one storyline, and one storyline is how you get surprised. Path 1, the adaptation path. The U.S. and partners adjust, learn, and harden. They improve layered defenses against cheap threats. They conserve high-end interceptors. They increase point defense and lower cost options. They tighten coordination and reduce the cost exchange penalty. This is the path where the weakness gets mitigated, not because it never existed, but because systems evolve under pressure. Path 2, the attrition path. The conflict environment stays saturated. Threats continue. Defensive inventories get drawn down. Replacement and replenishment become the quiet crisis behind the headlines. This is where you might see increasing urgency in defense industrial discussions, allied burden sharing, and changes in posture. It's not dramatic like a missile strike, it's slow like a leak, but it shapes strategic choices. Path 3, the miscalculation path. This is the one that scares serious people, and it has nothing to do with movie villains. In saturated environments, mistakes become more likely. A misidentification, a defensive overreaction, a strike that hits something politically explosive, a chain of fast decisions with imperfect clarity, and then the pressure to respond escalates faster than leaders can slow it down. That's why the real weakness of modern war isn't just hardware, it's the combination of speed and uncertainty. Now, if you want to know which path we're on, don't look at the loudest headline, look at the signals. Do we see movement toward cheaper defensive solutions to reduce the cost exchange problem? Do we see indications of sustained pressure on U.S. regional facilities and partners? Do we see continued navigation interference and uncertainty across key waterways? Do we see broader geographic spread of attacks? Because those are the indicators of whether system stress is rising or being contained. And public reporting suggests this environment has included repeated attacks and ongoing risk factors across the region, not just a single isolated event. The Washington Post. Now, I want to land this with a clean answer that doesn't oversell itself. Has Iran discovered a weakness in America's war machine? If by weakness you mean a single fatal flaw, no. But if by weakness you mean a repeatable way to impose cost, friction, and risk through saturation, cheap threats, and geographic pressure, then yes, that's the playbook. And it's been visible in the region for years, and it's showing up again now. Stars and stripes. And the most important takeaway isn't a dunk. It's a warning. Modern war is changing, not because the big platforms don't matter, but because the small, cheap, repeated pressures can shape the big decisions. Now I want your take, and I want it in a smart way. Do you think the real vulnerability is the cost exchange problem, expensive defenses against cheap threats? Or do you think the bigger vulnerability is the geography, forward bases, and regional political constraints? And if you had to bet, do you think the next evolution is better low-cost defense or more sophisticated saturation attacks designed to overwhelm any defense? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you want more breakdowns like this, no panic, no propaganda, just clean frameworks for what's actually happening, subscribe.